February 1881, on London's Richardson's Field, the first ever rugby game took place between the best players of England and the best players of Wales. There was no stand or terraced bank, and the game was watched by a small crowd standing 3 deep behind a rope. The Welsh had 9 university graduates and 3 clergymen on their team. But God was not on their side. England won by 8 goals to none, 82-0 in modern values. The Welsh have desired revenge ever since.
Wales-England is a unique day out because it's the only time we can really put the boot into England. And without chip on our shoulder, that's what we're going to do.
It is just total hedonism, carnage, colour, most of it good-natured.
In England, they have this tradition of coarse rugby and coarse songs. We sing hymns. We have choirs on the field. A wonderful guy called Hayden James conducts them, and will actually be conducting the whole crowd. Just unbelievable.
Land of my fathers. It sings of the people and of our heroes and our country and our land and our freedom. That song at Cardiff will send the shores of anyone back.
Of singing an anthem before a rugby international to the world. The anthem still has that power. You will see grown men crying in the stands. You'll see players, lips wobbling, eyes filling with tears. It is immensely moving.
Challenge Cambridge to bring 23 of their finest men to do battle for the 137th men's varsity match. Do you accept our challenge?
I, Nick Costa, captain of Cambridge University Rugby Club, accept your challenge. I will bring 23 of the best players that this university has to offer, and we will do everything in our power to retain our title.
At the start of the 20th century, rugby was a purely amateur game played just for recreation by the future leaders of the establishment. These young men, who would take the best jobs as lawyers, bankers, or politicians, would continue merrily up the rugby ladder from public school to university.
Rugby became a sport associated with the upper classes, with the moneyed classes. You were upper class when you played it, and then to continue playing it afterwards, you had to pay money to continue to play it in a non-university environment.
It was just an entirely different universe. It was like going into a separate galaxy. I became boldly aware of the fact that it was very much an upper-class enterprise, start to finish. I was filled with excitement about what was this place. tradition of being clapped off the field by the losers, the drinking your beer immediately afterwards in the clubhouse with muck and mud on you. And they didn't have showers in many of these clubhouses at that time, and so they had these giant bathtubs.
We find touch, I find touch, we're gonna find touch together. We feel all right in the middle of the night, finding touch together.
The level of camaraderie among the squads, I loved it.
Whilst rugby was a gentleman's game, not all gentlemen were English. Rugby-playing old boys spread the game to other British universities.
Ireland was run by Britain, and all of the universities and all of the educational and institutional bodies were all run with the British hand.
This was not always a positive. Rugby flourished at Protestant Trinity College, but the sport was resented by the country's Catholic population, its presence a blatant reminder that Ireland was governed by London.
In Ireland, sport is deeply political. So rugby was officially, according to the dogma of the time, a foreign game. The Irish Rugby Football Union, they associated with the oppressor. Rugby was the game of the ruling classes.
The population surge from migrants in the booming coal and steel industries provided the catalyst in popularizing rugby among different classes.
It really was completely different in Wales to the way it was in the south of England. And one of the nice things was the diversity in rugby. You would have miners next to lawyers, and it worked.
Wales is a very complex small country. The original kind of melting pot of people coming in from elsewhere and then creating something that was distinctively Welsh 100 years later.
But Welsh economic and social prosperity was built on the backs of men operating in the severest conditions. Workers depended on each other for survival, and the bonds they forged spilled over into everyday community living.
We are now 765 yards below the surface of the earth, and about a quarter of a mile from the pit bottom, working what is known as a 4-feet seam.
It was a grim industry. Your dad or your uncle going down underground, coming home filthy dirty every day. They'd have a shower when they came out of the pit, but they would always be grimy.
I look at my own family. Both grandfathers were miners. I didn't know them because they died decades before I was born, in their 50s because of mining.
There were so many men who worked in the pits those days, and each community was a strong sort of community, and I think rugby clubs were all part of those communities.
In the valleys, rugby was the miners' salvation from being locked underground or in front of giant furnaces.
When they had the chance to get out onto that field, it was as if they wanted to free themselves of all that intensity that they'd been subjected to for the whole week.
Everyone said that the hardness of Welsh rugby was because they all worked in factories, mines, etc.
They were incredibly proud, honest men, and that transferred to the rugby field, I think.
So it becomes a game that represents the best of Welsh society. And we become very good at it.
Bigger opportunities in this room for me was for us to fucking get back on our horse. Fucking wounded animals are far more fucking dangerous than someone who thinks they're gonna come here and have a fucking fluffy night pouring all over us.
Within a tiny radius of valley towns and villages, fierce rugby rivalries mushroomed.
Don't fucking wish for it, boys. Fucking work for it tonight, okay? Come on, let's go.
Those valley bastards, they were 2 miles apart, or 4 miles apart.
That all be chanter and a so intimidating. Very gladiatorial, tribal.
If you grew up in Ebervale, for instance, And if you went down to play for Newport, down the valley to a big ground in a big city, you'd be hated for the rest of your life.
Once encountered, the intensity of Valley's rugby would be something opposition players would never forget.
We went to play the game, and Buck was down the back of the line-out, and he got, this guy was pulling his jersey. He said, don't do that, don't do that. Did it a couple more times with that. And he knocked all his front teeth out, right?
The thing is, he shouldn't have done what he done, you know? And I warned him.
And went to the dinner that night, and Buck had the teeth stuck in his hand.
I'd met him afterwards, and he had his front teeth missing, but that's life.
So Buck's there sitting across the table from this guy. And I always remember looking, and this guy was so happy. He was like, and he had all his teeth missing. And he was so excited that Buck Shelford had knocked all his teeth out, you know.
I said, oh, okay. And then I talked to a few of his mates. He lived on that story for years, you know.
Rugby pride was also strong in Scotland, the fourth of the home nations. Like Wales, rugby was embraced by town and country.
Rugby in Scotland has come from two places. It's from the private education sector, which is called public schools, as they call it, the posh kids, or the rural people who lived in the borders of Scotland. There was a rivalry of all the border towns because, you know, we're literally only 5 miles from the border here, and we're fairly staunch in defending the border against the English.
Nationalism and a desire to prove who's best now led to a landmark event in international sport. In 1871, a group of Scottish rugby players challenged their English counterparts to a one-off game in the centre of Edinburgh.
Scotland won. It was a very strange scoring system. You could get nil, you could have 1 point. It was totally different from the current system.
This first international was no genteel occasion. With 20 players on each side, the controversial encounter lasted nearly 3 hours, with only an umpire in walking shoes and his best suit and tie to settle disputes.
It demonstrates the importance that rugby now has in those places where it's strong, cities like Edinburgh, and as it will become important to other major cities across Britain.
By 1882, annual rugby matches between the 4 home nations were eagerly anticipated. These games were known as tests, for they tested a player's courage and manliness.
Rugby starts to reflect a kind of imperial rivalry between the countries at the heart of the British Empire.
The upper-class game of young amateur men found itself attracting huge crowds and widespread publicity. In tests, national pride was always on the line, especially when playing England. Rugby embraced a new philosophy. Winning mattered more than participating.
It was about this kind of carnival of rugby shifting between the capital cities with thousands of people following the cavalcade.
I don't think there's anything to touch the atmosphere in Twickenham when you've got a big game on. I think that is a very, very special place to be.
I think all sport is about proving you're better than the other country, the other person, the other team. It's just the way it manifests itself.
Winning isn't everything, but wanting to win is. And that's the essence of rugby. You play rugby, you want to win.
Coal and steel restored more than Welsh pride in the 19th century. They fueled the engine of the greatest occupation the world has ever known.
Britain has colonial dominance over something like 1/5 of the world's surface.
Britain's control of the sea was absolutely central to the control of the empire. Britannia rules the waves. So Britain in the middle of the century was wealthy, visionary, self-confident, and hugely, hugely powerful.
His Majesty's Navy scoured the oceans for territories which Westminster annexed. Without a backwards glance, the British proceeded to rule over indigenous peoples as if everyone was now one race, a British race. One of Britain's smallest colonies would soon alter the course of rugby forever. It was isolated at the furthest edge of the empire.
My family came over to this country in 1841, and, you know, they had one chest, and they were given a title to a little piece of land. Now, you've got to be pretty hardy, don't you, to hop on a boat if you come from Kent in England and go to the other side of the world, and one of their children died on the way there, and then you arrive and you look around and say, where's my new life?
New Zealand was effectively a farm for Britain. Basically, we fed Britain, and the more the British farmers became factory workers, someone had to feed these burgeoning cities. And with technology, such as steamships and railways, New Zealand became a food source of Britain.
After a cautious beginning, race relations between indigenous Maori and European newcomers steadily deteriorated over the contentious issue of land ownership. British forces waged war against the poorly armed Maori and took control of the country and land.
The British had the technology and the numbers, but the Maori did superbly well in some of the battles. They were militarily more advanced in some forms of warfare than the British, because the Maori were fantastic warriors.
My great-great-grandfather was one of those British soldiers that were killing Māori, but then he ended up marrying a Māori woman. You know, then that brood started from there, and that's when the Shelford name first came to New Zealand.
In the uncertain aftermath of peace, British settlers drew on home comforts like sport.
Rugby, cricket, golf, tennis, but especially rugby and cricket, follow the British to their colonies. They come to these countries with a mission to civilise.
Rugby went everywhere in the world with the exploration of the British Empire. And it took hold in areas that Britain colonised.
And of course, you know, what greater tool to preach the gospel, this new gospel of civilization, than sport, than those games with rules like rugby.
Training's going to be fun tonight, don't you worry about that. There's going to be some contact and there's going to be some hard work, and mistakes are not going to be accepted.
Still going to have fun.
By the 1870s, rugby was established up and down New Zealand's patchwork communities and small towns. British settlers, mostly middle or working class, were fanatical early adapters.
Sport was a way that you could bring unification with the local populations, and then it became a way that the local populations could find their own identity, express themselves.
It's like a family thing. Everybody in the family was interested in it. All your neighbours were interested in it. Everybody at school was interested in it.
It was our culture, it was our way. I think it was a game that suited our mentality.
New Zealand is like Brazil in soccer. It's the country of rugby. It's a country where rugby is more than a sport, is not a way of life, it's a religion.
The choice in the weekend in the winter was to either play rugby or to sit at home with mum and dad.
It brought families together. You know, Dad especially be out all week, and then Friday night sitting in front of the fire, cleaning our boots,
getting up in the morning, listening to the cancellation service of 1ZB to make sure we were playing. And then we'd all jump in the car, pile in the car and head off to the local rugby club.
Like other important things to a New Zealander, rugby's with us from the cradle to the grave. Learning a leisure activity for its own sake was never more important to our youngsters.
Mum ran the tuck shop, and then Dad would coach my brother's team. We'd have a big Ben pie, and then Mum and Dad, after the game, would go into the clubhouse and have a few drinks. And the kids would be outside, you know, replicating these senior players.
The inclusion of Indigenous players into English sports was usually a social taboo in the Victorian era. But Māori took to rugby as if it were custom designed.
But intensity, urgency, 80 minutes, work hard. Let's go to Mahi, I'll take. Do the big one.
Basically, the white man came out into this game and we become good at it. I believe Māori brought to the game the ability to play a game at a high level, you know, the speed that they played the game. They were fast, they were big, powerful men. They changed the people who brought the game here. For the game to grow in New Zealand, you had to have the Māori people playing.
I was in the second 15 at Tauranga Boys College, and this little Maori guy was running towards me with the ball. I tried to tackle him. He hit me so hard, I flew through the air. And I remember thinking, fuck that, I don't want to do that anymore. He was about 5 foot tall, 5 foot wide and everything else, and bang, I just took off.
Like the social mixing of Welsh Valleys rugby, in New Zealand the game crossed class and colour lines that would be unthinkable in England.
It didn't matter whether you were working as a labourer, on the farm, in a factory, in an office, student, no matter whether you're Maori, no matter whether you're European, you're in a team, it's very inclusive.
Rugby became a place where they did unite. Some say rugby and the freezing works were the two logical places where the British and Maori interacted.
You know, a lot of our people, a lot of our Māori people became very good rugby players, right from the get-go.
In the late 18th century, the British established control at present-day Cape Town over a resident population of indigenous Africans, including Xhosa, Dutch-descended settlers, and 30,000 slaves.
The reason was to control the Cape Sea route to the east and make sure the French did not take it over from a weak Dutch authority.
From the beginning, there was a mutual loathing between the British and the Dutch, who were called Afrikaners or Boers.
Our identity was a source of constant skirmish. I'm also like a half-breed. My father married an English woman, which is absolutely not done in his nationalist circles. It was considered an act of treachery, and the same thing with my mother's family. So that's the other civil war, the one that's often not seen.
This antipathy turned toxic after the discovery of gold and diamonds on Afrikaner land, which the British then decided should be theirs. This series of conflicts was the Boer War.
It was their Vietnam because it took more than 3 years when they thought it would be a matter of weeks, and tremendous casualties on both sides.
The rest of the world turns on Britain and says, you know, you are hypocrites. There are cartoons run in newspapers all over Europe showing Queen Victoria wading through seas of blood.
But they then made peace with the Boers and said, let us create a new Union of South Africa in which Dutch-speaking whites and British origin whites then control this country for white people.
For some, the fractured relationships never fully healed, with lasting consequences.
Let me say this. The most virulent form of racism I've ever come across in South Africa is the racism of English liberals, especially of the middle and upper middle classes, towards Afrikaners. There was absolutely no doubt.
Afrikaner whites, for them, the Voortrekker Monument was their symbol of liberation and achievement from particularly British oppression. And they saw the Voortrekker Monument as their shrine.
Rugby was the unlikely glue to mend the broken nation. Despite their loathing of its English roots, rugby held an almost spiritual appeal to the Afrikaner psyche.
We want an elite game. And that's what rugby offered us. And we'll beat them at their own elite game.
It was a source of absolute terror to have to play against an Afrikaans girl because these guys were so tough with their short hair. And they were deadly, and they took rugby so completely seriously.
I think it's in our genes, this rugby thing. I cannot explain it, but it's something magic.
And your son didn't get into the first team, you had to consider sort of retiring to the study with a revolver and putting the bullet in your brain because of the humiliation that you had enjoyed.
In the early days, South African rugby was very much based on physical strength. And our forwards, dominant forwards. And the legend is built around that powerful physical dominance.
You, as a kid, you dream of becoming a Springbok. And you'll play a game of touch rugby, and just like if Carl du Plessis scored a try like he did, I do the same, score a try, and so that's, yeah, so it was pretty cool.
This is the most coveted trophy in South African rugby, the Currie Cup. At Newlands, Cape Town, there's a large crowd to see who wins it.
Domestic South African players would be seen through a prism of identity. Were they British or Afrikaans?
Yeah, you get your English-speaking guys, there's good guys, there's brilliant guys, and then you get your Afrikaans guys, very aggressive, make contact, and really like the physical stuff.
With rugby proving so popular within the white dominions, the first international tours began. By 1905 and 6, New Zealand and South Africa were deemed worthy enough to send national teams to take on the best in the British Isles. The home unions considered their success a formality. So did the opposition.
The tour was self-consciously used to promote the unity of the white races in South Africa. So you had people who had fought for both sides in the war in the same team in 1906.
New Zealanders care deeply about what the rest of the world thinks. We like people to know we exist, and one way to prove we exist is to excel in sport.
To everyone's amazement, the colonials comprehensively defeated the British teams.
Rugby was a weapon that we wanted to use against the British. This was their chance to vent their rage against the English.
This was to show the world and to show the colonies that this is what we can do well, and we take pride in doing it well. So it becomes important as a national statement.
The defining moment of the 1905 tour was the Welsh Test. The New Zealanders took rugby pretty seriously, but they had nothing on the Welsh. And the level of intensity, the level of passion that they found in Wales took them completely by surprise.
They'd heard about this terrifying war dance that was scaring the living daylights out of every team they encountered on their tour. So it was decided they should counter the haka. They said, OK, we will sing the Welsh national anthem in response to the haka.
In Wales, the vast crowd immediately took up Land of Our Fathers, and those who were watching and those who were writing about that game said the All Blacks were visibly unsettled.
And apparently the New Zealand captain said he'd never heard anything like it, that the spirit of which the Celtic heart was capable. And that's how music and rugby became entwined ever more. I can't overstate the importance of this match. It's a seminal moment in Welsh cultural history.
The New Zealanders received an overwhelmingly proud homecoming.
And that was where probably the love of the game really started in New Zealand. And with that, we had huge success. And people liked success, and we're good at it. And we got better and better and better.
In South Africa, the tour was hailed as an outstanding success.
The 1906 team started a pattern of domination over the British. There's something deep in the All Black and Springbok psyche about not losing to the British.
Both New Zealand and South Africa returned home with another first. From now on, they would be known around the world as the Springboks and the All Blacks. For the next 60 years, rugby remained largely predictable. However, war would prove a terrible exception.
We lost a huge number of rugby players. And rugby wasn't played during that First World War. It actually stopped.
The world was mired in this horrible sort of endless slog in the trenches.
No team was left unscathed. Entire clubs were wiped out. An estimated 60% of international rugby players from all corners of the empire died.
When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today.
The RFU see the First World War as a triumph of their virtues. Because, well, A, Britain won, so British values obviously succeed. Rugby became the game that symbolised the sacrifice of the war.
Rugby was really important to those men because they went into battle with their teammates. And in many respects, you go into battle playing rugby with your teammates. And so the values were very similar.
Slowly, rugby recovered, and national teams toured again. But things weren't as before. Rugby was no longer an empire's game, but a Commonwealth sport. Touring was any player's career high.
We've come here to play good open football.
On field, games were competitive. Off field, things were very social and sometimes naughty. A tour's unofficial secrets act was rugby's concept of discretion, better known as what goes on tour stays on tour. rugby's ethos as a simple recreational pastime had long gone with the wind. Victory was now the prize. Winning mattered to players, fans, clubs, the media, even entire countries.
But the Irish team in those days, they played a crude form of rugby, and it was all heart, passion, piss and wind.
3 countries were at the top, and that's Wales and South Africa and New Zealand. It gave them some nationalism and some national fervour, and the 3 of those countries played an extremely physical game.
I have 2 grandsons, and I asked them the other day, what would you like to be one day? I'm hoping that they would say a winemaker or a farmer. They said, Opa, we just want to be Springboks. So all South African boys want to be Springbok rugby players.
And I suppose having a father who played against the Welsh in '53 and lost, you know, Dad never went back to Wales because he couldn't bring himself to go back to Wales, literally. It does sound a bit strange, and he's probably up there saying, don't tell them, son.
Such an emphasis saw players adopt new levels of aggression, blurring the lines of acceptability. In front of the English king at Twickenham, the home of rugby, in 1924, All Black Cyril Brownlee was the first player sent off in a test.
There was a lot of foul play in those days because there was no television. Touch judges had no rights other than to determine when a ball went into touch. And there were no replacements. And so if you could get a few of them off the field, that made your job so much easier.
The referee starts to run off in that direction. That's his back. So things happened, you know, and punching and kicking and all that sort of stuff. There were guys that did that. I played in the Canterbury game in '71. Sandy Carmichael, I think he had 27 hairline fractures in all his face. You know, he was a mess, to say the least.
There is guys that went out, you know, finger in the eye or the nose or they call this the fish mouth grip, you know, the guy get you, and then you just leave the ball. Or they grab you there by your goonies or whatever to leave the ball.
The 20th century introduced one of rugby's most beloved institutions, the Lions. A composite selection from the very best British and Irish rugby players. Touring a couple of times a decade to the Southern Hemisphere, the Lions were unique and cheered by everyone.
In England, Wales, Ireland, Scotland, once you've been capped, you've got one more Everest to climb.
The Lions was really special because suddenly you were one of only, 30 players selected across 4 teams.
We knew as a group how few guys in each position had actually worn that famous red jersey.
He sees an opening. He's over.
You have a little badge where you have the Scottish, the Welsh, the Irish and the English emblems in one. It is iconic, right? You normally spend your time knocking the 7 bells out of the other 3 around your little badge, and then all of a sudden you go in a team and you're all mates and you've all got the same badge on.
The fun and the crack that we had was exceptional, you know, particularly when the opposition are squealing and moaning in the background.
The British Lions were massively popular, partly because they very rarely won, so that was nice.
There was one rivalry above all others.
I think South Africa and New Zealand is one of the great rivalries, and when those 2 nations play each other, my goodness, sparks fly.
Incidents continued right to the finish of play.
In the 20th century, the Springboks had the best record of any rugby country. They had a better record than the All Blacks.
All Blacks in New Zealand were treated with a reverence that was quite extraordinary, in as much as little children wanted to get their autograph, dads want to talk with them and be their friend, and I'm not exactly sure what mums wanted to be to them, but they certainly liked them.
On Saturday afternoons when the rugby is on, my father's there with the wireless, right, and tuning it in, and then this wildfire of the crowds, like commentary. So when we scored, this explosion of delight. You can see this announcer just losing it completely and knocking his chair over as he leapt to his feet.
There was a notable difference between New Zealand and South Africa. In South Africa, rugby was strictly a whites-only game. Official segregation between the races was called apartheid, and rugby fully embraced it.
Rugby, the way we experienced it was very white. Your teams were completely white, and our colored friends and black guys had to play on their own.
When I was a kid, I could not play sport against a team that wasn't white or with anybody that wasn't white in my team. Sport was segregated from school right the way up to national level.
Behind this facade, South Africa had a long and vibrant history of coloreds and blacks participating in rugby. But these players were hidden from the record books, erased from rugby's white reality.
I grew up in the Eastern Cape where black people get born into rugby. You get told of how your dad played or your uncle played. This game gets shoved down your throat that, you know, such and such a guy was such an icon. I did this back in my days. And you're like, wow, I want to be like that as well.
The people of color played it as long as the whites played it. We were just sort of segregated in regards to the laws, the apartheid laws. But these players were as good as the white counterparts playing for South Africa.
So it was sort of something like a custom to us, rugby. We used to play games against coloreds. Black rugby and colored rugby, everybody was socializing.
It was never shown on TV. Clips that you'll see on TV are like a Frick de Preer scoring a try for the Springboks. But you'll never see a guy like Themba Ludwaba.
We had fixtures. We used to test our strength against those teams. And then we called ourselves Black Springboks. And they called themselves Colored Springboks.
My father played rugby when he was in school. And even to this day, he still has a serious gripe about what happened in apartheid and the opportunities that were taken away from him. It is a serious injustice.